The moment Ella Leland rode into Dustcreek, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1878, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, and not a single one of them knew that the woman sitting straight-backed on that chestnut mare was carrying a heart so thoroughly broken it had practically become a second skeleton inside her chest. She had ridden 3 days from Santa Fe, her saddlebags packed with everything she owned, which amounted to 2 dresses, a wool blanket, a bone-handled knife her father had given her before he died, a small leather journal, and approximately $47 in coins. She had left behind a man named Douglas Hart, a cattle broker with smooth hands and smoother words, a man who had told her for 2 full years that she was the only woman he wanted, right up until the morning she had walked into the hotel dining room in Santa Fe and found him sitting across from a dark-haired woman from Albuquerque, holding her hand across the white tablecloth and whispering things that Ella recognized as the very same things he had once whispered to her. She had not made a scene. That was the thing people who knew Ella Leland understood about her. She did not make scenes. She had stood in the doorway of that dining room for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Douglas to look up and meet her eyes, long enough for his face to go the color of ash, and then she had turned around, walked back upstairs, packed every single thing she owned into those saddlebags, and ridden out of Santa Fe before the sun had climbed a quarter of the way up the morning sky. She had not cried until she was 20 miles outside the city, alone on the high desert road with nothing but red rock and sage around her. And even then she had cried only for about 10 minutes before she had wiped her face on the back of her sleeve, squared her shoulders, and told herself out loud, to the empty land around her, that she was done. Done with men who made promises like they were handing out coins they did not actually own. Done with waiting. Done with being the woman who stayed patient and faithful while somebody else made up their mind about whether she was worth it. Dustcreek was not her original destination. She had heard the name from a freight driver she had passed on the road, a sunburned old man with a white mule who had told her that Dustcreek had a new schoolhouse with no teacher, a decent boarding house run by a widow woman, and a general store that actually kept its shelves stocked. 3 things that sounded, to a woman who had spent 2 years in Santa Fe working as a seamstress for wages that barely covered her rent, like the beginning of something better. So she rode into Dustcreek on a Tuesday morning in April, and she pulled her mare up in front of the boarding house, which had a hand-painted sign reading LOTTIEPEARCE, Clean Rooms Fair Rates, and she climbed down from the saddle with the careful stiffness of someone who had been riding for 3 days straight. The woman who came out onto the porch was somewhere around 50, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pinned back under a sun-bleached bonnet, and the kind of face that had clearly once been very pretty and had since become something much more interesting. She looked Ella up and down with frank, assessing eyes. "You look like you rode hard and slept poorly," the woman said. "I am Lottie Pierce. You need a room." "I need a room, and I would like to know if the school position is still open," Ella said. Her voice was steady. She had always been good at that, keeping her voice steady when nothing else was. Lottie Pierce smiled. "Come inside, I just made coffee." The town of Dustcreek was not much to look at. It had a main street with about 12 buildings on it, including the general store, a saloon called the Spur, a livery stable, a smithy, a small church, the new schoolhouse, and a barber shop that also served as the town's only medical office. There were perhaps 200 people living in or near the town, with another scatter of ranchers and homesteaders in the surrounding territory. The land around it was high desert scrub oak and pinon pine on the hillsides, red earth roads that turned to rust-colored mud when it rained, mountains to the north that still carried snow on their peaks in April. Ella got the teaching position. The town council, which consisted of 4 men who met in the back room of the general store, interviewed her the morning after she arrived, and she answered their questions with the kind of clear, direct confidence that came from having nothing left to lose. She had 2 years of formal schooling herself, plus 3 years of self-education through borrowed and purchased books, and she had spent 6 months in Santa Fe helping the church school on weekends without pay, which she did not mention because she did not want to appear to be asking for sympathy. They hired her at $20 a month plus the use of the small house attached to the back of the schoolhouse, which was barely more than one room with a stove, a bed frame, and a window that looked out on the eastern hills. It was the best situation she had been in for years, and she knew it, and she settled into it with a fierce kind of gratitude. She met Seth Boone on her 4th day in Dustcreek. He came into Lottie's boarding house for supper, which Lottie served family style at a long table for anyone in town who wanted a hot meal for 15 cents. Ella had been eating there every evening while she waited for the schoolhouse to be finished being cleaned and the teacher's cottage to be made livable. She was sitting at the far end of the table, eating cornbread and beans, and listening to the conversation around her without participating in it, when the door opened and a man came in who made the room shift in some indefinable way. The way a room shifts when someone enters who takes up more than their physical space. He was tall, not remarkably so, but tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the low beam of the doorway. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and the kind of lean, capable build that came from actual work rather than any effort toward appearance. His clothes were clean but worn, a dark blue shirt, canvas trousers, boots that had been resoled at least twice. He carried his hat in his hand when he came indoors, which Ella noticed because not all men bothered. He sat down across from her without seeming to particularly notice her, which was fine, because she was not looking to be noticed. Lottie introduced people over the supper table as was her custom, saying names and general facts about each person the way a schoolteacher calls roll, and when she got to Ella she said, "This here is Ella Leland, our new schoolteacher, just come from Santa Fe." The man across the table looked up. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Gray, the color of the mountains in the early morning before the light got to them properly. "Seth Boone," he said. "I run the livery stable. Your horse is in good hands." "Thank you," Ella said. "She is particular about her feet." "I noticed," he said. "Left front. She favored it a little when you came in. I reshod her this morning. No charge." Ella blinked. That was 30 cents worth of work at least, possibly more. "I will pay you," she said. "You just got here," he said, and looked back at his food. "Consider it a welcome." She considered him for a moment longer than she meant to, and then she looked back at her own food as well. That was how it started, which was to say, it did not start at all, not really, not in the way that stories usually begin with a beginning. It was more like two people in the same small town going about their lives in parallel lines, occasionally crossing, occasionally speaking, building something without knowing they were building anything. Ella opened the school on the first Monday in May, with 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 13. She was 24 years old, and this was the first classroom she had ever had that was entirely her own, and she stood in front of those 14 children on that first morning with chalk in her hand, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as purpose. She was good at it. She had always known she would be good at teaching if she ever got the chance. She was patient without being soft, clear without being cold, and she had the rare ability to explain things in multiple ways until one of them found its way through. The children liked her. Their parents cautiously began to like her too. Seth Boone she saw regularly, because in a town of 200 people you could not help but see the same faces with great frequency. He kept her horse and any other horse that needed keeping. He was at Lottie's for supper most evenings. He nodded to her on the street. He occasionally stopped to talk briefly about practical things, the weather, the condition of the road north, whether she had gotten the stovepipe in the teacher's cottage to stop smoking, which had been a problem for her first week. She would not have said in those early weeks that she thought much about him. He was a feature of the landscape, like the mountains and the red dust and the sound of the smithy's hammer. She was not in Dustcreek to find anyone. She was in Dustcreek to find herself again, and those were not the same project. But she noticed things, because she had always been a noticing sort of person. She noticed that he was unfailingly kind to the horses in his care, not in a sentimental way but in a practical, attentive way. The way someone is kind who understands that kindness is the most efficient approach. She noticed that he was quiet at the supper table but not sullen, that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he did speak people tended to pay attention. She noticed that he helped old Mr. Carey, who had a bad hip, carry his feed sacks from the general store without being asked, and without making anything of it. She noticed that he kept his stable clean and his accounts honest and his word, as far as she could tell, absolutely reliable. She also noticed that half the women in Dustcreek, married and unmarried alike, seemed to have a particular warmth in their expressions when they spoke about Seth Boone, and she noticed this the way you notice a thing that does not especially concern you, and filed it away. It was Lottie who told her about Caroline Walsh. It was a June evening, about 6 weeks after Ella had arrived, and she and Lottie were sitting on the boarding house porch after supper while the sun went down behind the western hills in a long, theatrical blaze of orange and rose. Lottie had brought out 2 small glasses of whiskey, which she did occasionally on special evenings, and they were sitting in the easy silence that had developed between them. The silence of 2 women who had found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they genuinely liked each other. "You know Seth Boone has been sweet on you since approximately the 2nd day you were here," Lottie said, without preamble, in the way she said most things. Ella turned her glass in her hands. "I did not know that," she said carefully. "He does not show it much," Lottie allowed. "He is not a showy man, but I have known Seth Boone since he came to this town 4 years ago, and I know his face. He watches you when you are not looking." "I am not interested," Ella said. Lottie was quiet for a moment. "Because of the man in Santa Fe." "Because of men in general," Ella said. Then she softened it slightly because Lottie did not deserve sharpness. "I just got here. I am not interested in, I am not looking for anything like that." "That is fair," Lottie said, and dropped the subject, which was one of the things Ella appreciated most about her. But the conversation had done something to the way she looked at Seth Boone, even though she had not wanted it to. She was more aware of him now. She caught herself noticing when he was at supper and when he was not, noticing the particular way he talked to his horses, noticing that he read actual books, not just newspapers, which surprised her because she had not expected it, and which she discovered when she found him one afternoon sitting on the step outside the livery stable with a battered copy of a Washington Irving collection open on his knee. "Irving," she said, stopping before she meant to. He looked up. "You know him." "I have read most of what he wrote," she said. "My father had his books. What made you choose him?" Seth Boone looked back at the page for a moment, considering. "He writes about landscapes like they are alive," he said. "That appealed to me." Ella looked at the mountains to the north. "Yes," she said. "I understand that." She walked on. But she thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon, and she was not entirely sure why. The summer came in hard and hot and dry, the way summers came to the high desert of New Mexico territory, and Dustcreek settled into its summer rhythms. School ran through July because Ella wanted to give the children who were behind a chance to catch up, and she kept her classroom as cool as possible by propping both doors open and hanging wet burlap over the windows in the worst afternoon heat. It was in the first week of July that Seth Boone did a thing that she found herself unable to dismiss as easily as she would have liked. There was a family named Ortega who lived about 4 miles outside of town, a couple named Maria and Raphael with 3 children, one of whom, a boy named Tomás, was in Ella's class. The Ortegas were Mexican, which in the New Mexico territory in 1878 was a complicated situation. The territory had been part of Mexico barely 30 years before, and there was still a great deal of ugliness about who belonged and who did not, who was owed respect and who was not. Ella had seen it in the way some people in town talked about the Ortega children, a casual dismissal that made her blood heat under her skin, though she had kept her expression neutral and her classroom absolutely even-handed. One afternoon after school, she was walking back toward the teacher's cottage, and she saw Seth Boone in the middle of the main street, standing very still and very steady between a man named Dale Prout, who was large and loud and had been drinking since noon, which everyone in town knew because he did this with some regularity, and Rafael Ortega, who was in town to pick up a part for his plow, and had made the mistake of being in the wrong place when Prout decided he wanted someone to be unpleasant too. Prout was saying things that Ella would not repeat. Seth was not saying anything. He was simply standing there between the two men, his arms loose at his sides, his eyes on Prout with an expression of absolute calm that somehow communicated something more clearly than any threat would have. "You want to walk away, Dale," Seth said, and his voice was quiet and even and carried in the still afternoon air. "You want to go sleep it off. And then tomorrow you are going to want to apologize to Mr. Ortega here, because he is a man going about his business and you are embarrassing yourself." Prout stood there for a moment, working his jaw, and then something in the quality of Seth Boone's stillness apparently communicated itself, because he turned and walked away, muttering, toward the spur. Seth turned to Rafael Ortega. "I am sorry about that," he said simply. "He does not speak for this town." Ortega looked at him for a moment and then nodded once and said, "I know," and that was that. Ella stood where she was until both men had gone their separate ways, and then she walked to her cottage and sat down on the step and thought, with a careful, controlled kind of thoroughness, about what she had just seen. It had not been dramatic. There had been no violence, no speeches. He had simply placed himself in the gap between cruelty and a man who did not deserve it, and held that ground without making anything of it. She thought about Douglas Hart, who would have walked past on the other side of the street. She made herself stop thinking about it. The confrontation did not change anything, she told herself. It did not change the fact that she had come to Dustcreek to build a life for herself, not to be half of something. It did not change the fact that she did not trust her own judgment about men, not anymore. Not after 2 years of being wrong in a very specific and humiliating way. It did not change the fact that she was 24 years old and had a classroom full of children who needed her and a cottage of her own and a life that was, for the first time, entirely hers. None of that changed, but the landscape around her had shifted, even slightly, in the way the light shifts when a cloud moves. July passed and August came, and things continued as they were. Ella taught school and ate at Lottie's and talked to people in town and read on her evenings, and gradually became part of Dustcreek in the way that a good teacher becomes part of a small community. Not with fanfare, but with the slow, steady accumulation of being useful and present and kind. She and Seth Boone talked more, in the way that people in small towns talk on the street, at the supper table, occasionally pausing for a few minutes in the spaces between their respective days. She discovered, in fragments, that he had come to New Mexico territory from Tennessee, that he had learned horses from his father and his father's father, that he had been in the territory for 4 years and in Dustcreek specifically for 3. He was 28 years old. He had no family in the territory, only a sister back in Tennessee whom he wrote to every month. He did not talk about himself as though he were performing his own story. He talked about himself the way someone talks who is comfortable with what they are, and does not feel the need to make it sound like more. She also discovered, in the particular way you discover things in small towns, that he had been spoken for once, about 2 years before she arrived. A woman named Caroline Walsh, who had come to Dustcreek as a merchant's wife and stayed after her husband died, and who had spent several months in what the town had apparently understood to be a courtship with Seth Boone, before deciding that she wanted something larger than Dustcreek and moving to Denver. This was relevant information. Ella was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that it was relevant information, and honest enough to acknowledge why. She heard it from Lottie, not as gossip but as context, because Lottie was the kind of woman who understood that context was not the same thing as gossip. He was not heartbroken, Lottie said, over their evening coffee one night in August. I think he was more resigned, like he had suspected it would end that way and was not surprised when it did. She was a fine woman, but she always had one eye on the horizon. He is not a man who has one eye on the horizon. He is a man who puts down roots. Ella thought about this. Did he love her? She asked and was surprised by how directly the question came out. Lottie considered. I think he was willing to love her, she said. There is a difference. Ella understood the distinction. She understood it in a specific, personal way that she did not share. 2 days later, she went to the livery stable to check on her mare, whose name was Copper, for the color of her coat, and found Seth there alone, working a new set of shoes onto a big gray gelding who belonged to a rancher named Whitfield. He was bent over the horse's hind hoof, bracing the leg between his knees, and he did not hear her come in. Copper saw her and whickered softly, and he looked up. Sorry to interrupt, she said. You are not interrupting, he said. Copper is in the second stall. She ate well this morning. Ella went to her horse and let herself be nosed at, which Copper did every time as though reassuring herself that Ella was still there. She stroked the mare's neck and listened to the sounds of the stable, the quiet shifting of horses in their stalls, the sound of Seth working, and felt with some surprise that she was comfortable here, that she felt easy in this space. Can I ask you something? She said without particularly meaning to. He straightened from the gelding's hoof and looked at her over the horse's back. Ask it, he said. Why did you reshoe Copper when I first arrived? You did not know me. You had no reason to do that without asking. He seemed to think about this as a genuine question deserving a genuine answer. She needed it, he said, and you looked like you had enough to worry about without adding that to it. Ella looked at him for a moment. What did I look like? She asked. His expression was careful, neither unkind nor flattering, like someone who had made a decision they knew was right but had not yet stopped feeling the cost of it. She was quiet for a beat too long, and she knew it. She looked back at Copper. That is a very accurate description, she said. I did not mean to pry, he said. You were not prying, she said. You were observing. There is a difference. He nodded once and went back to the gelding's hoof, and she stood with Copper a while longer than she had intended in the comfortable dim of the stable before she said goodbye and walked back to the school. She was falling for him. She knew it the way you know a thing when you have been trying not to know it for long enough that the effort itself becomes exhausting. She knew it in the way she recognized his footfall on the boarding house porch steps before she saw him. She knew it in the way she had started, without meaning to look for his opinion when something happened in town, not by asking it, just by finding her eyes going to his face to read what was there. She knew it in the specific quality of the warmth that moved through her when he smiled, which he did rarely enough that it felt like something worth noticing when it happened. And it frightened her completely. She had been here before. Not in exactly this form, but she had been in the territory of falling, of trusting, of beginning to build something around another person. And she knew exactly how thoroughly that territory could give way beneath your feet. She had been Douglas Hart's devoted, patient, trusting companion for 2 years before she walked into that hotel dining room, and nothing had prepared her for how wrong she had been about every assumption she had made. She was not that person anymore. She was not going to be that person again. September came, and with it the school's second term, and Ella threw herself into it with an energy that she recognized, in her more honest moments, as partially displacement. She expanded the curriculum. She started a small lending library, using a shelf in the classroom and a rotating collection of books contributed by families in town, supplemented by 3 volumes of her own. She organized an evening reading event for parents. She wrote letters to the Territorial Board of Education asking for additional funding and supplies. She was busy. Busy was good. Busy was uncomplicated. And then one evening in late September, everything became complicated. She was walking back from the schoolhouse after a long evening grading slates when she heard someone crying near the alley between the general store and the barber shop. A low, trying to be quiet kind of crying that she recognized immediately as someone who did not want to be heard. She stopped. She went to the alley. It was a girl named Rosa Ortega, Tomás's older sister, who was 15 and did not attend school because her parents needed her help at home, which was a situation Ella had been quietly trying to find a solution to for 2 months. Rosa was sitting on the ground against the wall with her knees drawn up, and she was crying in that particular way that suggested she had been crying for a while and had moved past the acute stage into the hollow, exhausted stage. Ella sat down on the ground beside her without asking permission, because sometimes asking permission created a space for people to refuse help they needed. It came out in fragments. Rosa had been spoken to that afternoon by a man in town, a cattle buyer passing through, who had said things to her on the street that she should not have had to hear, things that were specifically about her being Mexican and young and female, and she had had no recourse, no one to say anything, no one to stand between her and it. And she had come home and tried to be fine about it, and had found that she was not fine about it, and had slipped out of the house because she did not want her parents to see her cry because it would worry them and possibly provoke her father into something dangerous. Ella sat with her for a long time. She did not offer platitudes. She said very honestly, "What happened to you today was wrong. It was wrong and it should not have happened, and you did nothing to cause it, and you do not have to be fine about it." And then she sat quietly while Rosa worked her way through the rest of it. And when Rosa was ready to go home, Ella walked her to the edge of town and watched her go, and then stood alone on the darkening road, and felt the deep, old anger that had been in her since childhood, the anger of someone who had watched the world be casually unjust and had never been able to stop seeing it. She turned back toward town, and Seth Boone was standing at the end of the alley, which startled her. "I saw you go in," he said. "I waited to make sure everything was all right." "It is not all right," she said, "but Rosa is home." He looked at her. "Do you want to tell me?" She told him briefly what had happened. His jaw tightened. He asked her who the cattle buyer was, and she told him the name she had caught, and he was quiet for a moment and then said very evenly, "He already left town, but I will ask around." "What will you do if you find him?" she asked. "Make sure he knows that Dustcreek is not a town where that kind of behavior is welcome," he said. His voice was quiet. It was the same voice he had used with Dale Prout in July. She looked at him in the fading evening light, this man who put himself in gaps, who reshod a strange woman's horse without being asked, who read Washington Irving and spoke with absolute quiet steadiness when it mattered, and she felt the wall she had been building so carefully and deliberately for 7 months tremble a little. "I need to go home," she said. "All right," he said. "Thank you for waiting," she said. "Of course," he said, as though it had never been a question. She walked home and sat on the step of her cottage and looked at the stars, which were extraordinary in the New Mexico territory, abundant and close and so clearly themselves that they seemed less like a backdrop and more like a presence. And she had a conversation with herself that was honest and not particularly comfortable. She acknowledged that she had feelings for Seth Boone. She acknowledged that they were not small feelings. She acknowledged that he had done nothing to create or encourage them except to be consistently, undramatically, genuinely himself. She acknowledged that this was not sufficient reason to ignore the fact that she had been completely wrong about a man before, and that being wrong about a man in the specific way she had been wrong had a particular flavor of humiliation that she never wanted to taste again. She also acknowledged, sitting under those stars, that Douglas Hart and Seth Boone were not the same person in any way that she could identify. She acknowledged that at some point the decision to keep herself safe from the possibility of being hurt again became indistinguishable from the decision to stop living fully, and she was not sure she was not already in that territory. She did not come to any conclusion that night, but she sat under those stars for a long time, which was itself a kind of answer. October came, and with it the first real cold of the fall, and Dustcreek put on its autumn colors, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold, the oak brush on the hillsides going rust and amber, the sky a shade of blue so specific to high altitude and dry air that it seemed like a color that did not quite exist anywhere else. It was in the second week of October that Seth Boone did a thing that broke through the last of Ella's careful architecture. He had been helping her over the previous few weeks to get extra firewood stacked against the school cottage for winter. This was practical help. The cottage had a small stove, and the winters in the territory could be genuinely cold. He had not made anything of it. He had simply shown up one afternoon with a load of already cut wood in a wagon and said that he had a surplus from a tree he had taken down, and would she like it? And she had said yes, and he had unloaded it and stacked it neatly and gone back to the livery. He had done this 3 times. Each time he stayed to help and they talked, and the conversations had been getting longer. On this particular October evening, he had stopped by the cottage to drop off one more load, and she had invited him in for coffee because the evening had turned cold and the stove was going, and it seemed the natural, hospitable thing to do. He sat at her small table with his hat on his knee, and she made coffee in the blue enamel pot that was one of her better possessions, and they talked about the school. She had been describing a situation with one of her students, a boy named Henry whose family was preparing to leave Dustcreek for California, and who had started behaving in ways that Ella recognized as the behavior of a child who was terrified of a change he had no power over. "He breaks things," she said. "Not violently and not out of meanness. I find things broken near where he has been, a slate, a piece of chalk, a book left on the floor, and he looks terrified every time I find it, like he is waiting for me to be furious. Because he expects to be punished," Seth said, "for feeling what he is feeling." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." "What did you do?" "I kept him after class yesterday," she said. "I told him that leaving a place you love is one of the hardest things there is, and that it makes sense to feel angry about it, and that breaking things was not the most useful expression of that anger, but that I understood why he did it, and that California was going to have him whether he was angry or not, and that he might as well arrive as someone the other children there wanted to know." Seth was quiet for a moment. "What did he say?" "He cried," Ella said, "for about 5 minutes. And then he helped me clean the classroom, completely unprompted." Seth smiled. It was not a wide smile. He was not a wide smile kind of person, but it was real and warm, and it reached his eyes, and Ella felt it like a hand placed gently on her sternum. "You are very good at what you do," he said. "I love it," she said. "It is the only thing I have ever been in the right place doing." He looked at her. "What brought you here?" he asked. Not aggressively, not pryingly. The way someone asks who actually wants to know. She set her coffee cup down. She had been waiting for this question for 5 months, and she had various prepared, deflecting answers to it. And she opened her mouth to give one and then, for reasons she could not entirely account for, did not. She told him about Douglas Hart. Not every detail, but the outline of it. 2 years, a promise she had understood as real, the hotel dining room, the woman from Albuquerque, the $47 and the saddlebags and the open road. She told it plainly, without self-pity and without dramatizing, which was the only way she knew how to tell it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said. And he said it in a way that meant exactly what it said, with none of the qualifications or reflexive deflections that men sometimes put around expressions of sympathy. "It was not your fault," she said. "No," he said. "But that does not change that it happened to you and that it should not have." She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. "I am not telling you this to explain anything," she said. I am not making a case for anything. I'm just answering your question." "I know," he said quietly. She looked up at him. There was something in his face that she could not quite name, not pity, not the particular performative sympathy that was really just a path toward something else. Something more careful than that. Something that felt like being truly seen rather than observed. "The man was a fool," Seth said, and his voice had a quiet certainty to it. Not because he lost you, though that is a fool's outcome, but because he had you and was looking elsewhere. I cannot understand that. Ella felt the words land somewhere specific inside her. You should not say things like that, she said, and her voice was a little unsteady, which she did not entirely like. Why not? He asked. Because I am not in a position to hear them the way you perhaps intend them, she said. I am not. I came here to build something for myself. Not to be the second thing someone settles for when what they originally wanted did not work out. The silence in the small cottage was suddenly very full. What makes you think you would be a second choice? He asked. I know about Caroline Walsh, she said, and she said it directly, the way she said everything difficult, looking at him rather than away. He did not flinch or look away. He did not rush to justify or deflect. He held her gaze steadily and was quiet for a moment that she respected him for, because it was the quiet of a man thinking clearly rather than reacting quickly. What do you know? He asked. That there was something between you, she said, before I came here. There was, he said. It was not what it may have looked like from outside it. I was willing to try, and she was willing to be tried for a while, and then she was not, and it ended. I was not heartbroken. He paused. I was honest with myself after about why I had been willing when perhaps I should have known better, about what I was hoping it would be and what it actually was. And what was it? She asked. Something I settled for, he said very quietly, because the alternative, which was to wait and hope for something that might not come, felt like a kind of arrogance, and I was wrong about that. She was very still. Ella, he said, and it was the first time he had said her name like that, with the weight fully on it. I am not going to tell you that I do not have feelings for you, because I do, and lying to you about it would be insulting to both of us. I'm also not going to make you any promises you are not in a position to receive right now, but I want you to know you have not been a second choice. You have been the measure against which every choice has been measured since the first week you were here, and I am sorry if I did not make that clear in a way you could trust. Ella stood up from the table. Not in anger. She did not think it was anger she was feeling, though it was large and warm and frightening. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark night and the distant lights of the town, and the mountains she could not see but knew were there. I told you, she said, I have no interest in being somebody's second choice. I know, he said behind her, and I am telling you, you have always been my first. She did not turn around for a long moment. She stood at the window and breathed and felt the enormous, terrifying possibility of what she was standing at the edge of. She had been here before, or had thought she had been, and she had been wrong. She did not trust her judgment. She had told herself that comprehensively and repeatedly for the past 7 months. But she also knew, in the specific, unargumentative way that the body knows things the mind has not yet caught up to, that what she had felt watching him stand in that street in July, what she had felt hearing him describe a landscape as alive, what she had felt sitting in his company in this small room on this cold October evening, was nothing like what she had felt with Douglas' heart. What she had felt with Douglas had been the warmth of being selected, of being wanted, of fitting into a space that had been held open for her. What she felt with Seth Boone was something more like recognition. Like looking at a thing and having the specific, surprised sensation of having seen it before from the inside. She turned around. He was still sitting at the table, his hands around his coffee cup, looking at her with that steady gray gaze that she had come to know over the past months as the most honest face she had ever seen. I am afraid, she said. That is fair, he said. I was wrong about someone before, she said. I was completely wrong about what I thought I knew, and I have not trusted my own judgment since. That is also fair, he said. I am not asking you to trust me on credit. I am asking you to give this a chance to show you what it is, at whatever pace makes sense to you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I would like to go for a ride with you on Sunday, if you are willing. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not with the performance of relief or joy, but with a particular quieting, as though something that had been held very carefully could now be held a little less tightly. I would like that, he said. They went for that ride on Sunday, through the gold-andrust hills above the town, on a morning so clear and cold that their breath made small clouds in front of them, and the mountains to the north seemed close enough to touch. They rode for 3 hours, talking sometimes and not talking sometimes, and both kinds of time felt right. After that, they rode every Sunday morning that the weather allowed, and the Sundays began to be the clearest part of Ella's week, the part she looked forward to with a specific, warm anticipation that she stopped trying to minimize or explain away. She was falling, and she knew it, and she had made, at some point in November that she could not pinpoint exactly, the conscious decision to fall. It was not a reckless decision. She was not a reckless person. It was a decision made after everything she had observed about Seth Boone over 7 months. His steadiness, his honesty, his specific and consistent kindness, his willingness to hold a line when it needed holding and to let things be when they did not. She had watched him carefully and honestly, and she had concluded, with the methodical rigor she applied to everything, that he was a person worth trusting. That he was, in fact, the most trustworthy person she had encountered in a very long time. That conclusion did not make it less frightening, but it made the fear manageable. November deepened, and the first snow came to the mountains, and the evenings turned properly cold, and things between Ella and Seth deepened with it. He came to her cottage for supper 2 evenings a week, and she discovered that he could cook, simply, practically, but well, and they cooked together in the small space of her kitchen with a comfortable, easy domesticity that felt like something she had not known she was missing. He brought her books from a mail-order catalog he sent away to, and she added them to the school library after she had read them, and this struck her as one of the most intimate things anyone had ever done for her, to know what she would love to read and to find it for her. He told her more about Tennessee, about the farm where he had grown up, about the years after the war that had been brutal in ways he described without dramatizing. He told her about his decision to come west, which had been made in a winter of particular despair, and had turned out to be the right decision even though he had made it for the wrong reasons. He was honest about his past in the way she was learning he was honest about everything, without performing the honesty or making it a spectacle, just laying it out plainly and letting it be what it was. She told him about her parents, her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself, and had died when she was 17 of a fever that had moved through their town in East Texas like a slow fire. Her mother, who had remarried and moved to Louisiana, and with whom Ella had a relationship of polite, infrequent letters. The years between 17 and 22 when she had worked at whatever work there was, in East Texas and then in the Texas Panhandle and then in New Mexico, making her way toward something she could not quite name but had always suspected was out there waiting for her. Santa Fe and Douglas, and the particular seduction of feeling like she had finally found her way. "You had found your way," Seth said one evening when she had gotten to that part of it. "Just not with him." She looked at him across the table. "No," she said, "not with him." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it. And that was that. The first time they had touched, really touched, and it was nothing spectacular, just 2 hands on a rough wooden table in a small cottage in New Mexico territory in November of 1878, and it was everything. December came, and the territory settled into winter proper. The school went on its winter recess, and Ella had more time, and she spent most of it in ways that, she thought with a private, helpless warmth, would have been entirely unrecognizable to the woman who had ridden into Dustcreek 8 months before. She spent time with Lottie, who had become one of her dearest friends and who said, the first time Ella mentioned Seth with the particular involuntary softness that she had stopped being able to prevent, "Well, it is about time," and then changed the subject with characteristic tact. She spent evenings reading with Seth at his place, which was a 2-room house behind the livery stable that he had built himself, and which was spare and orderly and smelled of wood smoke and horses, and the particular clean smell of a space that was genuinely cared for. They sat on either side of his stove with their respective books and talked when something demanded to be shared, and did not talk when it did not. And Ella felt in those evenings a specific and particular peace that she had spent a long time not knowing she was looking for. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in December, standing on the step of her cottage after one of their suppers, in the cold and the dark with the stars blazing overhead. It was unhurried and careful and real, the kind of kiss that is less of a beginning than an acknowledgement of something that has been there for a long time, finally being named. She pulled back a little and looked at him in the dark, and he looked back at her with that same steady, honest gaze, and she said, "I am glad I came to Dustcreek." "I am glad you came to Dustcreek," he said. And then he said very quietly, "I have been glad every day since the first Tuesday in April." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. "You remember the day." "I remember the day," he said simply. She pulled his head down and kissed him again, less careful this time, and above them the New Mexico sky was its customary extravagance of stars. Christmas in Dustcreek was a modest affair by some standards, a church service, a gathering at the saloon that was more festive than usual, a potluck supper at the schoolhouse that Ella organized, and that became, somewhat to her surprise, a fairly large and warm occasion. She made pine wreaths for the schoolhouse windows with the help of her students, and decorated the space with red ribbon from the general store and paper stars that the children had cut out. The school had become, over the 8 months of her tenure, something the town was proud of, and the Christmas gathering felt like a seal on that. Seth sat beside her at the gathering and helped serve food and talked to people with the quiet, genuine warmth that she had come to understand was his characteristic register, and more than one person looked between them with the satisfied expression of a community that approves of what it sees. Lottie caught her eye from across the room and smiled with a complete absence of subtlety, and Ella shook her head slightly but could not quite suppress her own smile. She was happy. She was, recognizably and unambiguously, happy. The happiness felt different from the happiness of her time with Douglas, which she was beginning to understand had been largely the happiness of relief at being chosen, at having someone, at being able to stop worrying about whether she was enough. This was not relief. This was more like arrival. January of 1879 came in with a hard freeze that kept most people indoors for 2 weeks, and Ella and Seth spent those 2 weeks in the close, easy company that very cold weather requires when there is a warm stove available. And by the time the freeze broke, they had had conversations that covered more ground than most people cover in years about what they believed, about what they wanted, about what they were afraid of, about what they regretted, and what they would not regret. Real conversations, the kind that leave marks. In one of those conversations, in the warm amber light of Seth's stove on an evening when the temperature outside was well below freezing, she told him the thing she had not been able to say out loud before, even to Lottie. She told him that the worst part of what Douglas had done was not the betrayal itself, the other woman, the lies, but the way it had made her doubt her own mind. The way it had made every perception she'd had of herself, of him, of what they were to each other, seem suddenly unreliable. She told him that she had spent the 7 months before she let herself really look at him, testing every impression she had of him against the question of whether she might be wrong about it, whether she was seeing what she needed to see rather than what was there. And he said, "And I have come to the conclusion," she said, "that you are exactly what you appear to be, which is not a small thing. It might actually be the largest thing." He looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew now in every variation. "What did you conclude about what I appear to be?" he asked. "A good man," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. "I am not a perfect man," he said. "I know that," she said. "I am not looking for a perfect man. I am looking for an honest one." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so domestic and tender that it made her breath catch slightly. "You have one," he said, "for whatever that is worth." "It is worth everything," she said. February brought the school back into session and brought with it a change in Rosa Ortega's situation, which Ella was quietly proud of. She had been working, through the autumn and winter, on a solution to the problem of Rose's schooling, writing letters to the Ortega family, having careful conversations, finally arranging a schedule by which Rosa could attend school on 3 mornings a week, while a neighbor woman came to help Maria Ortega with the younger children. It had required patience and persistence and several conversations that were more about dignity and community than about logistics. And when Rosa Ortega walked into the schoolhouse on a February morning and sat at a desk and looked up at Ella with an expression that was shy and fierce and hopeful all at once, Ella felt she had done something that mattered. Seth was the one she told first that evening. He listened and said, "She is lucky to have you advocating for her." And then he said, with that rare smile that still made her feel the warm press of it in her chest, "I am lucky to have you here at all." Spring came back around the anniversary of her arrival, a year in Dustcreek, a year that had remade her in ways she had not anticipated and was deeply grateful for. The school had grown from 14 students to 21. She had started a lending library. She had established herself as a permanent, valued part of the community in a way that gave her a satisfaction she had never fully had before. She had Lottie, who was as close to family as anyone she had outside blood. She had the mountains and the red earth and the enormous sky that she had come to love with the specific, proprietary love you feel for a landscape that has held you during something important. And she had Seth, who was, she knew this now, with the same methodical clarity she applied to everything. The right person in the right place at the right time, which she had learned was the rarest combination there was. It was on a Sunday morning in April, exactly 1 year after she had ridden into Dustcreek on her tired horse with her $47 and her broken heart, that Seth asked her to walk with him to the creek. Not ride, walk, which was unusual enough that she looked at him sideways, but he said nothing further, just offered her his hand, and she took it. The creek was about a 1/4 mile from town, running through a stand of cottonwood trees that were just coming into their new spring leaves, the palest and most translucent green against the sky. It was a morning of perfect clarity, the kind of April morning the high desert occasionally produced as if in apology for every harsh day the rest of the year. The water was running high and quick from the snowmelt, and it made that particular sound, clean and constant, that Ella had come to associate with peace. He stopped at the bank of the creek, in the shade of the cottonwoods, and turned to her. He was holding something in his hand that she had not seen him take out, and when she looked at it, she saw that it was a ring, a small, plain silver ring, not elaborate, not expensive, but clearly made by someone's hand rather than purchased from a catalog, and she looked up at him with her heart doing something very specific and necessary against her ribs. "I had this made," he said. "Frank Carey made it. He is better at silver than people give him credit for." He paused, and he was not a man who was practiced in speeches, and she loved him for that. "I have been trying to think of how to say this properly, and I am going to say it plainly, because that is the only way I know how to say anything." "Say it plainly," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to spend my life in the same place as you. I want to build something real with you. And I want to do it here in this place that you have made your home, and that is better for your being in it." He paused again. "I know what you were carrying when you came here. I know what it costs you to trust. I want to be the last reason you ever have to doubt your own judgment, because your judgment was right. About me, it was right." Ella looked at him for a long moment, at this man standing in the young cottonwood shade with a silver ring in his hand, and his gray eyes completely open and honest and entirely steady. And she thought of the Tuesday morning a year ago when she had ridden into this town with almost nothing. And she thought of everything that had been built since then, carefully and honestly and in full view of itself. And she thought of the conversation she had had with herself under the stars. The one where she had admitted that there was a point at which keeping yourself safe from hurt became indistinguishable from refusing to live. And she thought that she was very glad she had made the decision she had made on that particular night. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which she was unreasonably moved by, and she thought briefly of asking how he had known the size, and then thought that she already knew the answer, which was that Seth Boone paid attention to things that mattered, and she was among them. He kissed her there at the creek in the cottonwood shade on the first anniversary morning of her arrival in Dustcreek, and it was a different kiss from the careful December kiss on the cottage step. It was the kiss of two people who know where they are going, which was forward. They were married in June of 1879 at the Dustcreek church, with Lottie as Ella's witness and the entirety of the town in attendance, because in a town of 200 people a wedding was a community event, whether you planned it that way or not. Ella wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself from fabric ordered by post, nothing extravagant, nothing she could not have made, but beautiful in the specific way that beautiful things made with skill and love are beautiful. Seth wore a dark coat that was clearly not frequently worn and looked like it had been recently brushed to within an inch of its life, and he stood at the front of the church with the same expression she had come to know as his fundamental one: present, steady, honest. She walked down the aisle of the small Dustcreek church on a June morning in 1879, toward the man who had reshod her horse on a Tuesday in April, because she had looked like she had enough to worry about, who had stood between a good man and cruelty, and held the line without drama, who had read Washington Irving on a stable step and described landscapes as though they were alive, who had told her the truth when she asked it, and waited for her when she was not ready and said, simply and without ornamentation, that she had always been his first. She reached him at the altar and he took her hands and looked at her, and what she saw in his face was everything she had concluded: he was honest, steady, certain, and love, clear and real and present. The ceremony was brief and genuine. They said what they meant. The town cheered in the particular collective way of small communities that have invested slightly in an outcome they approve of. Lottie cried, which Ella would have found more surprising if she had not, by that point, understood that Lottie Pierce was in fact a woman of very deep feeling who expressed it generally through directness and competence, and occasionally through tears at other people's weddings. The summer of 1879 settled over Dustcreek and over the new household of Ella and Seth Boone like something long awaited. They moved into Seth's house behind the livery, which they set about making larger. Seth added 2 rooms over the course of the summer with the help of 2 men from town, framing and raising and finishing in the good-natured, practical way of men who build things together. Ella arranged the interior with the specific aesthetic sensibility of someone who had lived without a home of her own for long enough to know exactly what she wanted, not elaborate, but considered. Good curtains at the windows, books on a proper shelf. A kitchen that worked the way she wanted it to work. She kept teaching. That was never in question. The town needed a teacher and she was the teacher, and the school was hers in a way that nothing had ever been hers before, and she was not going to give it up. Seth had never suggested she should, which was, she thought, folding laundry one evening while he read in the lamplight, one of the things she would always be grateful for. He had understood from the beginning what the school meant to her. He had never, not once, treated it as secondary to anything else. By September they knew she was expecting, and they told Lottie first, because she was family, and Lottie received the news by hugging Ella so tightly that Ella had to remind her that breathing was something she was still doing. Seth stood watching them with a happiness on his face so unguarded and genuine that Ella caught him at it, and felt her heart turn over in her chest, the same way it had been doing with reliable regularity since December of the previous year, and showed no signs of stopping. The pregnancy was straightforward, as these things went in 1879 in New Mexico territory, which was to say it was not easy, because nothing was particularly easy, but Ella was healthy and strong and had a constitution that did not admit easily to being slowed down. She taught through November and into December, when she reluctantly agreed to hand the school temporarily to a young woman from town, named Ada Whitfield, who had enough education and enough willingness to serve as a substitute. And she spent the last weeks of her confinement reading and sewing small things and having long conversations with Seth in the evenings that ranged from the practical to the philosophical with the ease of two people who had run out of things to be guarded about. The baby came in January of 1880, on a cold and still night, with Lottie in attendance and Seth outside the door in a state that Ella heard described later by Lottie as holding himself together by pure determination. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with dark hair and what appeared to be, in those early hours, his father's gray eyes, though Lottie said judiciously that you could never tell in the first days. They named him James after Ella's father. Seth came in when it was all over and safe and settled, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and Ella looked up at his face and saw something there that she had no word for and did not need one, the specific expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going and finds it to be exactly right. "Hello, James," Seth said softly to the small person in Ella's arms. His voice was its steady self, but with something additional in it, some new register. "I am going to do my best for you." "He knows," Ella said. Seth looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I know how it feels when you mean something," she said. James Boone grew through 1880 and 1881 with the confident, curious energy of a child who has been waited for. He was walking by the time he was a year old, and talking by the time he was 18 months, which Seth observed with the specific delight of a quietly proud father, and Ella observed with the specific amusement of a woman who had not entirely anticipated what it would be like to have a son who was constitutionally incapable of being still. She went back to teaching in March of 1880 with James in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom, which her students received with enormous enthusiasm, and which turned out, somewhat to Ella's surprise, to be pedagogically useful. Several of her older students became reliable in a new way when they understood that a small person was watching them. Rosa Ortega graduated from Ella's school at 17 with the highest marks of any student in the school's short history, and Ella helped her write a letter of application to a school in Santa Fe that trained women as teachers, and the letter was accepted. And on the day Rosa left for Santa Fe, Ella stood at the edge of town and watched the wagon go and felt the specific, complete joy of something accomplished. "She is going to be extraordinary," Seth said beside her. "She already is," Ella said. "The school just helped her know it." In the fall of 1881, Ella found herself expecting again, and this time the news was met with a different kind of certainty, not less joyful, but settled, because they were two people who knew now exactly what they were doing, who had built the foundation thoroughly enough to hold whatever was built on top of it. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1882, and they named her Clara, and she came into the world with Ella's brown eyes and Seth's expression of absolute focused attention, which made everyone who met her feel slightly assessed. Dustcreek itself changed in those years, the way all the towns of the New Mexico Territory changed in the years following 1878. The railroad was coming through the territory, and money followed it, and people followed the money, and towns that had been small and isolated began to find themselves less so. Dustcreek got a proper telegraph office in 1881. The school expanded to 2 rooms in 1882, requiring a second teacher, whom Ella hired and trained with the same methodical rigor she applied to everything. A new hotel went up. The population grew. Seth's livery stable grew with the town. He took on 2 hired men and expanded the stable itself and added a small wagon repair operation, and the business became something that could properly be called prospering. He was not a man who cared much for prosperity as a concept, but he cared about doing his work well and being able to provide for his family and his household, and he did both of those things consistently and without fuss. They had a life. That was the simplest way to say it. They had a full, real, daily life, ordinary in its texture, made of suppers and school mornings and children and animals, and the seasonal rhythms of a working household in a working town, and extraordinary in the specific way that a life built on something honest and chosen is extraordinary. Not without difficulty. Nothing was without difficulty. There were hard winters and a drought year in 1883 that was rough on nearly everyone in the territory. There were arguments, because Ella was not a woman who held her opinions lightly, and Seth was not a man who deferred when he believed he was right. And two such people living in close quarters were always going to have arguments. But their arguments were honest, resolved in the particular way of people who respect each other enough to fight properly and make up properly. There were also the quiet evenings that remained, years in, the thing Ella valued most. The evenings with the lamp lit and the stove going and the children in bed, and the two of them in the sitting room. Seth reading or mending tack or writing his monthly letter to his sister in Tennessee, Ella grading or reading or sewing, in the comfortable and specific silence of two people who are entirely at home in each other's company. She would look up sometimes across the room and catch him looking at her in a particular way, and she would think of the supper table at Lottie's boarding house in 1878, that first Tuesday in April, and of the woman she had been then, arms full of loss, determined not to need anything. And she would feel something that was not nostalgia exactly, more like a grateful tenderness toward both of them, toward the difficult and necessary path that had brought them to this specific evening and this specific life. James was 3 years old, and Clara was in her first year when Ella sat down one afternoon at her kitchen table and wrote a letter to her mother in Louisiana. It had been 4 years since she had done more than exchange the polite minimal correspondence that had become their custom, and she was not sure what made her do it then, except that she was sitting in her kitchen in the afternoon light with the evidence of her life around her, James's boots by the door, Clara's cradle in the corner, Seth's coat on the hook, the books on the shelf, the photographs on the wall, and she felt the specific surplus of a full life and wanted to share it. Even with someone she had grown distant from, she wrote honestly, which she had not always done with her mother. She described Dustcreek. She described the school. She described Seth with the care of someone writing about something they want to represent accurately. She described James and Clara. She said, near the end, "I want you to know that I am happy, not the kind of happy that is really just the absence of something bad, the kind that is the presence of something real. I hope you have this too." Her mother wrote back 3 months later, a longer letter than she had sent in years, and it was not a perfect letter and it was not a repaired relationship, but it was a beginning of something, and Ella put it in the small box where she kept important things and thought that beginning was often enough. Spring of 1884 brought the 5th anniversary of her wedding, and Seth came home that evening with a small package that turned out to contain a new volume of collected American literature, ordered from back east, which she had mentioned wanting 2 months before without thinking he had particularly noted it. She stood in the kitchen holding it and shook her head slightly. "You have been keeping that order for 2 months," she said. "3, actually," he said, with that rare, real smile. "It took longer than expected to arrive. You are an impossible man to do without," she said. "I know," he said. "You should probably keep me." She laughed and reached up and kissed him with the easy warmth of two people who have been kissing each other for 5 years and have not lost any interest in it. And Clara chose that moment to wake up from her afternoon nap with her characteristic urgency. And James came running in from outside with something that turned out to be a horned toad he was intensely proud of. And the kitchen became immediately and gloriously chaotic. And Seth scooped up the toddler and negotiated with the toad-bearing 5-year-old, and Ella started the supper, and the evening was its usual particular kind of perfect. Lottie Pierce had dinner with them every Sunday, which had become custom 3 years before and showed no signs of changing. She was close to 60 now, and had slowed slightly, and Ella kept a careful and affectionate eye on her in the way you watch over people who you love and who are aging in front of you. Lottie and the children had a specific and irreplaceable relationship. She told James stories of her own frontier years that were improbable enough to be entertaining and true enough to be worth keeping. And she had an apparently inexhaustible supply of patience for Clara's more theatrical moods, which was saying something because Clara, at nearly 2, was already demonstrating a personality of considerable scope. In the summer of 1884, Seth got a letter from his sister in Tennessee, their first actual letter exchange, as opposed to the regular correspondence they had maintained for years. She was coming west. Her husband had died the previous winter and her children were grown, and she had, she wrote, been thinking about New Mexico territory for some time. And now that she had nothing keeping her in Tennessee, she was going to see it. Her name was Margaret, and she arrived in August on the new rail line, a woman of 50 with Seth's gray eyes and a manner that Ella recognized immediately as a feminine version of her husband's fundamental character: quiet, observant, honest. She stayed with them for a month and then, to essentially no one's surprise, announced that she was going to stay in Dustcreek. And she and Lottie between them, 2 widowed women of a certain age and considerable capability, established a textile and dressmaking enterprise that became, within 2 years, one of the most reliable businesses in town. Seth watched his sister and Lottie Pierce navigate the establishment of their partnership with an expression that Ella identified as delighted, and she caught him wearing it one afternoon and said, "What? 2 of the most capable women I have ever known," he said, nodding toward the window through which Margaret and Lottie were visible at the new shop front, arguing about something with great energy and apparent mutual enjoyment, deciding to do something together. He shook his head. "God help anyone who is not paying attention." "God help you," Ella said, "if you fail to pay attention." "I have never," he said, looking at her, "failed to pay attention to what matters." She felt it the way she always did, that press of warmth, that recognition, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was what she had not known to look for when she was younger, what she had not known to name. Not drama, not the consuming uncertainty of not knowing where you stood. This, the man who paid attention, the man who was steadily, daily, truly there. In the fall of 1885, Ella discovered she was expecting again, and this time they told everyone at once. James, who was 5 and received the news as a negotiating opportunity for more responsibility. Clara, who was 3, and received the news with the imperious benevolence of someone prepared to grant an audience. Lottie and Margaret, who received the news with synchronized celebration. And the general community of Dustcreek, which received it the way small communities receive the personal news of people they consider partly their own. The 3rd child was born in March of 1886, another boy, and they named him Thomas, called Tom from the beginning. He was the largest of the 3 at birth and the most immediately vocal, which suggested a personality that the household would need several years to fully calibrate to. Ella lay in the bed on that March morning with her newest child, while Seth sat in the chair beside her holding Tom, because she had asked him to so she could look at them both. And she thought about the Tuesday in April 1878 when she had ridden into this town with $47 and a broken heart and no particular plan, except to not be somewhere she had already been. She thought about Lottie coming out on the porch and saying, directly and without preamble, that she looked like she had ridden hard and slept poorly. She thought about the supper table and the man who had said his name and that her horse was in good hands. She thought about the long, careful journey from that evening to this one, the months of watching and considering, the evening in the cottage with the coffee cups, the walk to the creek with the silver ring, the church in June with the whole town present. She thought about the conversation that had mattered most, the one where she had stood at the window and said she had no interest in being somebody's second choice, and he had said, steady and unhurried and absolutely certain, that she had always been his first. She had not entirely believed it that night. She had wanted to, and she had been frightened too, and she had stood at that window for a long moment in the specific suspension between wanting and believing. She had believed it since, completely, every day, in every evidence he had given her, which had been substantial, steady, and consistent. She looked at him now, this man who was 35 years old and had crow's feet at the corners of his gray eyes and a slightly more weathered face than the one she had first known, and was more beautiful to her now than he had ever been, sitting with their third child in his arms with that expression she had come to know as the most honest thing she had ever seen. "Seth," she said. He looked up. "I need you to know," she said, "that I know. Everything I was afraid to believe that night in October. I know all of it now. I have known it for a long time. I just wanted to say it out loud." He looked at her for a moment, and the quiet was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need filling. "I know you know," he said. "Good," she said. Tom, apparently having decided this moment was insufficiently focused on him, made his opinion known with considerable volume, and Seth looked down at him with a startled expression that made Ella laugh, really laugh, from the bottom of her chest, and the room was suddenly full of noise and warmth and life, the ordinary specific perfection of it. And outside the window the New Mexico Territory spring was beginning in its slow, extravagant way. The hills going green at the edges, and the cottonwoods putting out their new pale leaves, and the sky the precise, impossible blue that she had learned to think of as home. In the years that followed, Dustcreek continued to grow, and the Boone household with it. James started school at 6 and proved to be his mother's son in the classroom, voracious and fast, and opinionated in ways that Ella found both challenging and secretly delightful. Clara at 5 was a force of nature who had discovered horses with an intensity that made Seth look at Ella with an expression of helpless recognition. Tom at 3 was sturdy and cheerful, and seemed to have arrived in the world with a fundamental confidence in its goodness that Ella hoped would serve him well. She had a school of 32 students by 1888 and 2 full-time teachers in addition to herself. She had a library that had grown to nearly 200 volumes, some purchased, some donated, some acquired through her persistent correspondence with the Territorial Education Board. She had fought, through letters and in person, for the right of children like the Ortega children to attend school without hostility, and she had not won every battle, but she had won enough of them that the school was, by the standards of 1880's New Mexico Territory, a genuinely equitable place, which was not nothing, and she knew it. Rosa Ortega had become a teacher herself, working at a school in Santa Fe, and she wrote to Ella every few months, letters that Ella received and answered with the particular warmth of someone watching a seed they had helped tend become something real. In 1887, Rosa visited Dustcreek with her husband, a carpenter named Lewis, and sat at Ella's kitchen table and talked for 3 hours, and when she left she looked back at the school as the wagon pulled away and said something to her husband that Ella could not hear, but that made him nod in a way that she could. Seth's livery and wagon repair had become the largest such operation in the county by 1888, with 5 employees and a reputation that drew customers from 3 days' ride in any direction. He remained fundamentally himself throughout the growth, unchanged in his essential character, uninterested in prosperity as an end, interested in doing good work and being reliable and being home in the evenings. They sat on the porch of their house, which had now been added to and modified twice, and was a substantial and comfortable place, with a proper front porch and a kitchen garden and a hitching post and a barn. On the summer evenings of 1888, a decade after Ella had first ridden into Dustcreek, and watched their children and talked and were quiet and were, without any ambiguity or reservation, happy. Lottie Pierce, at 64, had handed over most of the operation of the boarding house to her niece, who had come out from Ohio 2 years before, and spent most of her time with Margaret Boone at the textile shop, where the two of them remained a formidable enterprise and an even more formidable partnership. Lottie remained one of the constants of Ella's life, the person she went to when something was complicated, the person she laughed with, the person who had, on a Tuesday in April of 1878, come out on a porch and said directly and without ceremony that Ella looked like she had ridden hard and slept poorly. "I owe you a great deal," Ella told her once, on one of their porch evenings. Lottie considered this. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You did the work yourself." "You pointed me at it," Ella said. "I said a sentence," Lottie said. "You rode 3 days and built a life. Do not confuse those." Ella shook her head and looked out at the evening, at the town that had been hers now for 10 years, at the mountains in the north that were her mountains, at the red earth and the cottonwoods and the extraordinary sky. She thought about a woman on a chestnut mare with $47 and a bone-handled knife, 3 days out from her own worst mistake, riding towards something she could not name. She thought about how much could be made from almost nothing if what you started with was yourself. On the evening of the 10th anniversary of her arrival in Dustcreek, Seth came home from the livery with a bunch of wildflowers not purchased, just gathered from the hillside above town, the way he had occasionally done since the first spring they were married. He did not say anything about what day it was, because he did not need to. She took the flowers and put them in water and looked at him over the kitchen table with everything the past 10 years had made her. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. "Are you sorry?" she asked, which was not a real question, and they both knew it. He came around the table and took her hands, the same hands on the same table where the first real thing had happened between them, and he looked at her with his gray eyes and his honest face and said, with complete and absolute certainty, "You are the best decision I have ever made." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder and felt the full, unambiguous weight of a life well lived, and knew it for what it was. Outside, James was calling to Clara about something in the barn. Tom's voice could be heard somewhere farther back, happy and emphatic about something. Copper getting old now, but well kept and cared for, as everything Seth touched could be heard in the small paddock. The mountains to the north were holding the last of the evening light in the way they did, turning pink and gold, and the sky was doing its nightly extravagance above Dustcreek, New Mexico territory, above the school and the church and the livery stable and the boarding house and the textile shop, and all the small, essential architecture of a life that had been made from almost nothing, by a woman who had ridden in on a Tuesday morning with a broken heart and refused, quietly and completely, to stay broken. She lifted her head from Seth's shoulder and looked out the window at the evening sky. "I am glad I came here," she said. He put his arm around her and they stood together in their kitchen, in the warm and ordinary light, while their children's voices came through the windows and the mountains held the last of the sun. "I am glad every day," he said. And that was the whole truth, and it always had been, and it would be for every day that came after.